There is a sound a heavy chain makes when a strong man decides to swing it, and I had never heard it before that morning at Ambergate. It is not a rattle. A rattle is what a chain does when it is only a chain, coiled in a barrow or hung on a hook. This was a hiss that climbed into a moan, iron links leaning out against their own weight, gathering speed at the end of a thick arm, and it told every animal instinct in me to run. I did not run. I could not. I was 19 years old, and it was my first true posting, and I stood at the left pillar of the old river gate in a red tunic that still smelled of the tailor's chalk, with a bearskin 2 sizes too settled on my brow, and a rifle I had been taught to present and never to point. Beside me, at the right pillar, stood a man I had spoken perhaps 40 words to in the 3 days I had known him, and he did not move at all. His name was Imrise Calder. I want you to remember the stillness of him in that first second, because the whole of this story lives in the difference between that stillness and what came out of it. If you had walked past Ambergate at 9 that morning, you would have counted 2 ceremonial guards flanking a stone arch above the river road, and you would have thought us the same kind of ornament. 2 straight backs, 2 pairs of white gloves, 2 faces made of nothing. You would have been wrong about one of us, in a way that history books do not have a shape for. Let me set the morning down properly, because it matters that it began so ordinary. Ambergate is not the palace. It is an old toll arch on the river road 3 miles below the capital, a squat gatehouse of honey-colored stone that once took coin from every barge and cart coming up to the city, and now takes nothing at all but the salutes of the men posted there for ceremony. The household keeps a token detail at Ambergate the way a family keeps a grandfather's watch running, because stopping would be a kind of forgetting. On most days 2 of us stand our hours, tourists photograph the arch, a bargeman lifts his cap, and nothing happens that could not have happened 100 years ago. That morning was not most days. That morning the river road had been swept and the crowd barriers set, because Princess Adela was to pass through Ambergate at 10:30 on her way down to the coast towns, and before her, by long tradition, the Remembrance Ride would come up the road the other way. You will not have the Remembrance Ride where you are from, so I will tell you what it is. Once a year the old soldiers of the realm, and now the not so old, the ones home from the border postings with the shine still on their wounds, ride the river road from the Veterans Hall at Lowford up to the War Memorial on the Capitol Green. They ride whatever they have. Some come on the big touring machines they saved a decade of pay for. Some come too to a battered motorcycle held together with wire and stubbornness. Some ride in the sidecars because their legs no longer answer them and a comrade drives. They come up slow and loud, hundreds of them, engines braided into one long thunder, and the whole road turns out to watch. It is a beautiful, rough, honest thing, and the household times the princess's passage to salute it, so that the old riders come up through Ambergate under the arch and pass a pair of the king's guard standing at attention, and for one moment the ceremony and the machines stand in the same frame. I had been told all this the night before by Sergeant Hale, who ran the Ambergate detail and who had the gift, common to sergeants, of making a marvel sound like a chore. Riders come up from the south from 9, he said, tapping the map. Sanctioned column marshals front and back. They've done it 30 years, no bother. You present arms as the lead marshal passes, you hold, you don't gawp. Princess comes down from the north at 10:30 after the column's cleared. You present again. Between the 2 you stand and you keep the arch. Reeve. That was me. You'll be at the left with Calder. You do what Calder does. If Calder does nothing, you do nothing. Calder generally does nothing. A few of the older men had laughed at that, a short laugh with something underneath it that I did not understand yet. So there I was at 9, and the first of the riders came up out of the south mist with their headlamps burning, and it was every bit as fine as I had hoped. They came 2 and 3 abreast, filling the road, and the sound of them arrived before they did and went through the stone and up through the soles of my boots and into my chest. Old men with gray plates under open helmets. A woman with an empty sleeve pinned to her jacket and a chest full of ribbons, riding one-handed, steady as a judge. A boy, well, a young man, though he looked a boy to me, driving a sidecar in which sat an ancient rider wrapped in a blanket, upright as a king. One gloved hand raised the whole length of the arch in a salute he would not lower. I presented arms as the lead marshal passed, and I held, and something went hot and tight in my throat that had nothing to do with the drill. Beside me, Calder presented too, and I stole one look at him and saw that his eyes, forward as always, had a wet shine to them, quickly gone. It was the only human thing I had seen him do in 3 days. I filed it away. The column took near an hour to pass. That is how many of them there were. The tail of it thinned toward 10 o'clock. The stragglers, the slow, the toot-a-bike, and the marshals at the rear came up with their orange sashes and their whistles, counting the column home. I began, God forgive my 19 years, to be a little bored. The great sound was fading up the road toward the city. The barriers held back a good crowd on either side, families with flags for the princess who would come the other way in half an hour, and the whole thing had the settled, sunny, nothing more to see feel of a show that has peaked. That is exactly when the wrong sound came up the road. I want to be precise about how I knew it was wrong, because Calder knew it a full 3 seconds before I did, and those 3 seconds are the first small proof of everything I am going to tell you. The sanctioned column had a texture to its thunder, ragged, various, 100 different engines, each with its own cough and character. What came up the road now was a single tight knot of sound, hard and synchronized and fast, a dozen machines running as one with their throttles high, and it was coming up the wrong side. Along the cleared lane the marshals had just closed. Beside me, Calder's head turned. Only his head a few degrees, the way a hawk's does. Everything else about him stayed carved. But I had stood next to enough stone in 3 days to know when the stone was paying attention, and the stone was paying attention now. They came around the last bend below the gate, a knot of them, 10 or 12, on machines that had nothing to do with saved pay and stubborn wire. These were low and loud and mean, chromed and blacked, ridden by men in cut-off leathers with a device on the back I did not recognize, a hound's skull over crossed hammers, stitched in cinder orange. They came up fast into the cleared lane, and they did not slow for the marshals. And the marshals, 2 tired men in orange sashes who had been counting old soldiers all morning, scattered out of the road with more haste than dignity. "Hold your post," Calder said. It was the longest sentence he had said to me in 3 days, and it was very quiet, and I have never in my life obeyed anything faster. The knot of riders slowed as they reached the crowd, not out of courtesy, but the way a man slows walking into a room he intends to own. Engines dropped to a heavy, deliberate idle that you could feel in your teeth. The families near the barriers went quiet and gathered their children in. Flags stopped waving. The lead rider, a big man, bull-necked, a gray-shot beard cropped close, a chain worn as a belt with the buckle end hanging loose and long, walked his machine slowly up the last stretch toward the arch, toward us, and looked the gatehouse over like a buyer at a horse fair. He stopped his machine 10 feet from where I stood shaking inside my red coat, and he cut the engine, and in the sudden hole where the noise had been he looked at Calder and he smiled. "Well," he said, "look at the pretty statues, still here, still guarding the toll nobody pays." His voice carried, he meant it too. He had the ease of a man who had ridden into 100 quiet places and made them loud. "They should put you in a museum, friend, both of you, stuffed." Calder said nothing. Of course he said nothing. That was the drill and that was the man. But I, standing beside him, had begun to learn the difference between the nothing that is empty and the nothing that is loaded, and this was the second kind. The big man swung his leg off the machine and let it lean on its stand. The other riders cut their engines one by one, and the silence stacked up, 10 men's worth of it, and every one of them turned to watch their leader. He came a few steps closer, into the shade of the arch, close enough that I could smell the road on him, diesel and dust and old smoke, and he looked up at Calder's face under the bearskin with a kind of searching, testing curiosity, as if trying to find the seam where the stone might crack. "Not even a blink," he said, softer now, almost to himself. "They train that into you, do they? Stand there and take it, whatever comes." He tilted his head. "Somebody comes up and spits in your soup and you stand there and take it because the king says stand. That's a life, is it? That's a man." I did not know then what I know now, which is that the big man was not talking about soup, and was not in the deep places talking about us at all. He was talking about something that had happened to him a long way from that arch, and Calder knew it in the first 30 seconds. I am sure of it, the way he knew the wrong sound before I did. But knowing a thing and being permitted to say it are different countries, and a king's guard lives in the second one. "Marshals are coming back up," I heard myself whisper, more to steady my own hammering chest than to inform anyone. Down the road, the two orange-sashed men had recovered their feet and were talking urgently into a handset, and beyond them, far up toward the city, I could see the first outriders of the princess's escort turning onto the river road, still small with distance, still a good way off. 10:30. She was early, or the column had run late, and the timing that the household prided itself on for 30 years was, that morning, about to fail. The big man heard my whisper. Of course he did. I was 19 and could not yet whisper without moving my whole face. He turned his attention to me, and it was worse than his attention on Calder, because I was not made of stone and he could see it. "This one's new," he said, and he grinned, and a couple of his men laughed. "Look at him. White as his gloves." He came and stood in front of me close, and he was a head taller and half again as broad, and the chain at his waist swung its long loose end against his leg with a sound I would come to hear in my sleep. "What's your name, statue?" The drill is that you do not answer. I know the drill. But there is a distance between knowing the drill in a warm barrack room and holding it with a mountain of a man breathing road smoke into your face, and I felt the drill bending in me like green wood. "He has no name today," Calder said. It was the first time he had spoken since "Hold your post," and he did not raise his voice, and he did not turn his head, and yet the whole arch seemed to lean toward the 4 low words. The big man's grin faltered a half-inch. He had been working on me. The soft target and the stone at the other pillar had spoken, and that changed the shape of the thing. He walked away from me slow, and planted himself in front of Calder instead. "He speaks," the big man said. "The statue on the left speaks. Say something else, statue. Tell me to move along. Tell me I'm disturbing the peace of the king's road." He spread his arms wide, taking in the arch, the crowd, the whole bright morning. "Go on. Tell me what you'll do about it." Calder looked forward, past him, at nothing. "Nothing," the big man answered for him, and there was a curdle of real anger in it now under the show. "That's what you'll do. Nothing. Same as all of you. Same as the whole rotten lot of you did when it mattered." He was breathing harder. Behind him, his men had stopped laughing and stood watching with a stillness of their own, and I understood, dimly, that whatever this was, it had been coming up the road toward Ambergate for a long time, and had only put on its leather this morning. Then the big man reached down, and with one practiced motion unhooked the chain from about his waist, and let it fall its full length to the cobbles with a heavy, ringing clatter, and took the free end in his fist. It was not an ornament, that chain. I had thought it a belt, a bit of biker vanity. It was a tow chain, thumb-thick links of case-hardened steel, near 6 feet of it, the kind you sling under a broken machine to drag it home. In his fist it was a serious and terrible thing, and he knew it, and he let a length of it play out and swing gently by his boot so that we could all hear the weight of it kiss the stone. "Last chance, statue," he said, and he was not smiling anymore. "Look at me like a man, or I'll make you look at me." And beside me, Emrise Calder, for the first time in 3 days, moved his feet. It was not much. If you had blinked you would have missed it. He turned a quarter to his left, off the perfect forward stance, and slid his rear boot back a hand's width, and let his weight sink into it, and brought his rifle down from the present to the port across his body. All of it slow, unhurried, as if he were only easing a cramp. To the crowd it must have looked like a guard shifting his feet after a long watch. To the big man with the chain it registered as something else, because his eyes went to Calder's boots and then came back up to his face with a new question in them. I did not understand what I was seeing. I understood only that the still man had, for the first time, taken a shape, and that the shape was not the shape of a man about to be hit. It was the shape of a door closing. "Put it down," Calder said, 2 words level without heat. "Not for me, for the crowd behind you. There are families 20 feet away and that chain does not know the difference." For a moment, I thought the big man might do it. Something crossed his face, not fear. He was far past fear, but a flicker of the ordinary man who must have existed inside the leather before this morning wound him up. Then one of his riders, a lean one with a shaved head and a laugh like a hinge, called out from the back, "He's telling you what to do now, Doyle. The tin soldier's giving orders." And whatever door had opened in the big man's face slammed, and the name the lean one had used, Doyle, hung in the air, and I saw Calder hear it. I saw him hear it. That is the only way I can say it. His face did not change. But there is a way a man receives a word he has been waiting years for, a small settling, like a key finding at last the lock it was cut for. And Calder received the name Doyle exactly that way, and then went back to being stone. "You know the name," Doyle said. He had seen it too. He came a step closer, the chain swinging by his boot. "Look at that. The statue knows the name." His voice dropped, private now, meant for Calder and not the crowd. "You should know it. You've reason to. Where are you from, statue? Under all that fur and brass. Where'd they dig you up?" Calder said nothing. "I'll tell you where I'm from," Doyle said, and the show fell away from him, and what was underneath was raw and tired and older than the morning. "I'm from Ironmarsh, down the river. You know Ironmarsh?" "Course you don't. Nobody up here knows Ironmarsh. The forges that made the chain for half the king's ships, 300 years, and then one clean stroke of a pen up in your bright city, and the forges are cold, and the river families are on the road, and my brother—" He stopped. His jaw worked. The chain went still by his boot. "Never mind my brother," he said lower. "You people don't get to hear about my brother." I glanced at Calder, and I will tell you what I saw, because at 19 I did not have the sense to disbelieve my own eyes. I saw the stone man's throat move, once, a swallow he could not stop. I saw that the word Ironmarsh had gone into him like a blade going home. And I understood, in the way you understand a thing before you have any of the facts to hold it up, that these 2 men were not strangers, and that Ambergate was not where their quarrel had begun. Up the road, the princess's escort was closer now. I could count 4 outriders and the long black car behind them, coming down at a steady pace, perhaps a mile off, perhaps less. Whoever was controlling her route had not yet grasped that the arch ahead was blocked. The outriders came on. Beside me I felt Calder's awareness split, one part of him fixed on Doyle and the chain, another part reaching up the road toward the car, and I felt, without a word passing, exactly what he needed of me. "Reeve," he said, so quietly it barely cleared his lips. "When I move, and I will move, you do one thing. You do not draw, you do not swing. You put yourself between this and the barrier, you keep the families back. That is your whole war. Do you hear me?" "Yes," I breathed. "Say it." "Keep the families back, don't draw." "Good lad." And that gentleness, dropped into the middle of a nightmare, steadied me more than any drill ever had. Doyle had been watching us murmur, and it lit his temper. "Making a plan, are you, the 2 of you?" He barked, a laugh with no humor in it. "You want to know the plan, statue? Here's the plan. Your princess is coming down that road to smile at the coast towns and cut a ribbon and be photographed being kind. And she's going to find the road shut. She's going to have to stop. And she's going to have to look at us, at the men her people put on the road, and for once, for one morning, somebody in that family is going to have to see us instead of looking through us." His voice cracked on the last of it. "That's the plan. That's the whole plan. We shut the road and we make her look. And here is the thing that I have turned over in my mind every year since, the thing that separates a story worth telling from a mere brawl at a gate. For a grievance, it was not a mad one. The forges of Ironmarsh, I would learn, had truly gone cold. The river families had truly been moved off land their grandfathers held. A pen in the city truly had done it, in the careless way that pens in cities do things, and no one had come down to Ironmarsh to look them in the face and own it. Doyle was not wrong about the wound. He was wrong about almost everything else, about the arch, about the chain, about the two men in red who had drawn the short straw of standing where his rage arrived. But he was not wrong about the wound, and Calder, I think, knew that better than any man alive. Which is why what Calder did next has stayed with me longer than the violence that came after. He spoke to Doyle, not as a statue, not in the two-word blocks of a guard doing his drill. He turned his head, the whole head, breaking every line of the ceremonial stance, and he looked Rourke Doyle in the eye, and he said, in a voice pitched for one man only, "The chain bridge at Ironmarsh, the night the water came up, you had a brother on the span." The morning stopped. I do not mean the crutch that storytellers reach for, the crowd going silent, the birds ceasing. I mean that for Doyle the morning stopped, the whole roaring engine of his grievance stalled dead, and he stood in the shade of the arch with a 6-foot tow chain in his fist, and stared at a king's guard who had just reached 3 years and 100 miles into his private grief, and set a finger on the exact center of it. "What did you say?" Doyle whispered. "I said you had a brother on the span," Calder said. "The night the chain bridge went, I was there. I know what the water did. I know it was not fast enough for everyone. I have wanted for 11 years to say to someone from Ironmarsh that I am sorry and that it was not for want of hands, and here you are." He drew a breath. "So put the chain down, Rourke Doyle. Not because a guard told you. Because I was on the far tower that night and I am the last man alive who watched your brother go, and I will stand here after the princess passes, and I will tell you every true thing about it, if you will only put the chain down." I have replayed those words 1,000 times, and I still do not know how a man says them so steadily with his heart, as I would later learn, breaking clean across. But I watched Doyle's face while Calder said them, and I watched 11 years of built-up fury meet the one thing it had never expected to meet, not resistance, not a fight, but a witness, and I saw it stagger. For 3 seconds, we were that close to no violence at all. Then the lean rider with the shaved head, the one who had thrown the name Doyle into the air, the one who had come up the road that morning wanting a fight the way some men simply do, saw his leader wavering and could not bear it. He gunned his machine, jolted it forward out of the pack, and drove it straight at the barrier where the families stood, not to hurt them, I think, only to scatter them, only to keep the mourning loud, and a woman screamed and snatched a small figure up off the cobbles and stumbled back, and a flag went down under a wheel, and the whole fragile balance of the arch came apart at once. Everything happened then in the same half-second, and I will have to lay it out slower than it fell, or you will not believe a man could see it all. Doyle, jolted out of the spell of Calder's words by the scream, and shamed, I think, by his own hesitation in front of his men, did the thing his body had come to Ambergate to do before his heart could stop it. He turned his shoulders, and he swung the tow chain up and back over his head in a great looping arc, and he brought it down and around at Imrais Calder with the full turning weight of his body behind it. 6 feet of hardened steel, moving fast enough now to make that climbing hissintimone that I told you about at the very start, the sound I had never heard and have never forgotten. And I, remembering my one order, threw myself sideways toward the barrier and the families with my arms spread wide, shouting at them to get back, so that I did not see the chain reach Calder. I only heard what the crowd did, and then I turned, expecting to see my silent watchmate broken on the stones. He was not on the stones, he was inside the swing. I need you to understand what that means, because it is the hinge of everything, and unless I make you see it, you will think it was luck. A chain swung in a great arc has a terrible outside and a harmless inside. On the outside, at the tip, the steel is moving at the speed of a falling axe and will break whatever it meets. But near the hand, in the narrow pocket close to the man swinging it, the chain is slow, almost gentle, because it is only turning, not traveling. Every fighting man who has ever faced a flail knows this in theory. Almost none of them can act on it, because to act on it, you must do the one thing every nerve in your body forbids. You must step toward the chain, into it, closing the distance while the steel is still climbing, trusting your reading of the arc with your skull as the stake. Calder had not stepped back from the swing. In the half-second while I was throwing myself at the barrier, he had stepped in, driving off that rear boot he had quietly set a hand's width back 3 minutes earlier, ducking his head and shoulder under the rising loop of the chain, coming up inside it so close to Doyle that the two men were chest to chest, so close that the 6 feet of hardened steel wheeled around harmlessly over both their heads and passed, finding nothing but air where a skull had been a heartbeat before. And in the same motion, one motion, I swear it, unbroken, the portarm shift and the step and the duck, all one long sentence of movement, Calder's left hand came up and caught the chain. Not the tip. No man catches the tip. He caught it near Doyle's fist, in the slow pocket, his gloved fingers closing over the links exactly where the steel had no speed, and he rolled his wrist over the top of it in a way I had no name for then, and only learned the name of later, a turning trap that took the living arc of the chain and folded it back on the arm that drove it. The far end, robbed of the shoulder behind it, whipped around and wrapped once, twice, around Doyle's own forearm with a heavy clink, and Calder stepped through and turned his hips, and the chain that Doyle had swung to break a man became, in less than a second, a set of iron cuffs binding Doyle's own wrist to Doyle's own body. Doyle grunted, hauled back, tried to rip the chain free with all his bull's strength, and could not, because Calder was not fighting his strength. That was the thing I saw and did not understand and have spent years understanding since. Calder never once matched the big man muscle for muscle. He simply kept the wrist turned, the small joint at the end of all that power bent the wrong way over the bar of his own forearm, so that every time Doyle heaved, Doyle's own weight sold him out and folded him a degree further down. Strength poured out of the big man into a technique that drank it and gave nothing back, and in 4 heaving seconds Doyle went from towering over a statue to bent forward over his own trapped arm, down on one knee on the cobbles, the tow chain wound about him like a rope about a bollard, breathing hard, held and not marked. That is what I keep returning to. Held and not marked. No blood. No blow struck. A man who had swung 6 feet of steel at another man's head was on his knee in the dust with not a scratch on him, kept there by nothing but the wrongness of his own arm's angle and the calm of the man who had set it. Calder had not even lost the bearskin. He stood over Doyle, one glove keeping the wrist turned, and he was not breathing hard, and his face under the tall black fur was the same face it had been for 3 days, forward, composed, giving nothing except that his eyes, when they came down to Doyle's, were not a statue's eyes at all. They were full of something that looked, God help me, like grief. "Be still," he said to Doyle, low, almost tender. "You'll do the joint and injury pulling like that and I'd not have you hurt. Be still, Rourke. It's done. It was done before it started. Be still." I became aware, slowly, of the world coming back. The lean rider with the shaved head, the one who had driven at the barrier, had laid his machine down on the cobbles in his shock at seeing his leader dropped, and sat sprawled beside it staring. The other riders had not moved. A pack deprived of the head that led it is only 10 confused men. The families at the barrier had gone back and were clutched together, the small ones' faces hidden, but no one. I checked. It was my one job. No one was hurt. And up the road, no longer a mile off, no longer half a mile, the princess's escort had finally understood that the arch ahead was blocked, and had stopped. 4 outriders fanned across the road with the long black car halted behind them, close enough now that I could see faces at its windows turned toward Ambergate. But it was not the outriders and not the princess's car that made the morning change its nature a second time. It was an old man. He came out of the crowd on the eastern side, ducking under the barrier rope before anyone could stop him. An old man in a rider's jacket gone gray and soft with years. One of the remembrance riders who had lingered after the column passed to watch the princess go by. He was thin and stooped and walked with a stick, and he came out into the open road not toward the danger but toward Calder, and he was staring at Calder's left hand. The hand still turned over the trapped chain with his mouth working, and tears standing bright in the creases of his old face. And he said, in a voice that carried across the whole hushed arch because it shook so, "That's the running lock. I know that hand. I'd know that hand anywhere." He came closer, leaning on the stick, drinking in the sight of the guard as if he were a ghost walked up out of the river. 40 years I've watched the chain bouts at the Ironmarsh Fair, boy, 40 years, and I only ever saw one hand roll a running lock clean as that, out of a live swing, no room and no time. His voice broke entirely. You can't be, you're the quiet chain. You're Calder's boy. You're little Imrise off the Tower Forge. And Imrise Calder, King's guard, 3 years silent at the river gate, closed his eyes for one moment. The only time I ever saw him shut out the world, and when he opened them he said, quiet enough that only those of us near the arch could hear it, "I was, a long time ago. I have to leave the arch for a moment, because you cannot understand what happened next unless you know what the old man knew, and what I only pieced together over the months that followed, out of the old man's telling and Doyle's, and once, in a very few words, Calder's own. So let me take you down the river to Ironmarsh, 11 years before that morning and further back than that, and show you the boy who became the statue. Ironmarsh was iron and water. That is the whole of it. Where the river widened into its marshes, 300 years before, someone had found that the mud gave up a heavy, sullen ore, and where there is ore and water and reeds to burn, men build forges. By the time Imrise Calder was born, Ironmarsh was a town of forges strung along the river on timber wharves, and its great trade was chain. Ship's chain, anchor chain, the vast iron cable that in those days held the king's fleet to its moorings and dragged the king's timber down the coast. Ironmarsh made it, link by hammered link, and the men of Ironmarsh were chainsmiths the way other men are farmers, born to it, dying at it, the sons at the same anvil as the fathers. And where men work all day with a thing, they play with it at night. The chain bouts of Ironmarsh were older than anyone could say. On fair days the smiths would clear the yard by the Tower Forge and take up light practice chains, not the killing weight of a tow chain, but a supple 4-foot length, wrapped and padded at the tip, and they would spar, 2 men at a time, in a game that was half dance and half duel. The whole art of it was control. You scored not by striking your man, but by trapping his chain, by rolling a lock over his wrist, by turning his own swing back on him and pinning it, all without ever letting the padded tip touch flesh. For to lose control of the chain and mark your opponent was to lose the bout in disgrace. It was, the old man told me later, the most beautiful thing he had ever seen done with the human body, and the boys who were good at it were the pride of the town, and the boy who was best at it in 2 generations was Imrise Calder of the Tower Forge. They called him the Quiet Chain. Not because he was sullen, he was a laughing boy then, they said, before the water, but because of how he fought. Other champions swaggered and roared and played to the yard. Imrise fought in perfect silence, economical, still until the last instant, and the stillness was so total that men said watching him was like watching a held breath. And the release, when the lock rolled and the bout was won, was so sudden and so soft that half the yard missed it. He took the champion's belt at 17 and held it 6 years, and never once in 6 years of bouts did his chain mark a man. 6 years. That was the record they spoke of at every fair after. The Quiet Chain, who won 100 bouts and never drew a drop. I tell you this so that you will understand that when Rourke Doyle swung a tow chain at a king's guard at Ambergate, he was not swinging it at a soldier who had picked up a trick. He was swinging a chain at the greatest chainsman the river country had produced in 50 years, a man who had spent his boyhood learning the exact geometry of a swung length of steel, the way other men learn to walk, and who had spent it, above all, learning to end the swing without harm. Doyle could not have chosen, out of every man in the realm, a worse man to attack with that particular weapon, or a better one. Both things are true. Hold them both. Now the flood, now the chain bridge, and the night the water came up in the brother. The old chain bridge at Ironmarsh was the pride and the peril of the town. A span of the river carried not on stone, but on great iron cables, forged in the very yards it linked, a swaying road of planks, and chained that the river families crossed 100 times a day and cursed and loved. It had stood a century. It was never meant to stand against what came the spring Imrise Calder was 22. The rains that year did not stop. The river rose beyond any mark the old men remembered, brown and fast and full of torn trees, and it came up over the lower wharves and into the streets, and on the worst night of it, with half the town's forges already drowned and the families crowding to the high ground on the far bank, the river reached the chain bridge and began to work at its anchors. Word came that a moored barge, broken loose upstream, was coming down on the span. There were people still on the bridge, a knot of them caught midway, a family that had gone back for something. No one ever agreed what, and there was no time to get them off before the barge struck. Imrise Calder was on the near tower, where the great anchor cables came down to their pins. He was there because he was a chainsman, and the town's men had run to the chains when the water came up, as men run to what they know. And when the barge struck and the upstream anchor sheared and the whole span lurched and began to fold toward the flood with the people still on it, Imrise did the thing that made him, for 11 years afterward, unable to speak of that night. He took the loose end of a snapped anchor cable, a chain, his chain, the thing he had mastered, and he went out along the failing span into the dark and the spray, hand over hand, using every lock and turn and grip that 6 years of bouts had burned into him, and he began to pull people off the folding bridge one at a time and pass them back along the cable to the men on the tower. He got 7 off. The old man knew the number. The whole river knew the number. 7 souls came back along Imrise Calder's chain that night out of the mouth of the flood. And the 8th was a young man of Ironmarsh named Callum Doyle, Rourke's younger brother, who had gone out onto the span to help and been caught when the second anchor went, and whom Imrise reached, and had by the wrist in the dark with the water tearing at them both, and the planking under them broke apart, and the cable Imrise was locked to snapped its last pin. And in the black roaring instant that followed, a strength greater than any man's took Callum Doyle out of Imrise's grip and gave Imrise, alone, to the men hauling frantically on the tower. He had the wrist. That was the thing that unmade him. In 100 bouts his lock had never failed, and on the one night it would have meant a life. The river was stronger than the lock, and it took the boy and left the champion holding an empty turn of chain. They pulled Imrise out half drowned with his shoulder wrenched from its socket by the force of it, and he did not speak for 3 weeks, and when he could speak, he did not go back to the fair, and he never took up a practice chain again. The quiet chain went quiet altogether. Within the year he had left Ironmarsh for the city, and taken the king's coin, and asked. The old man did not know this part, but I would learn it, to be posted where nothing ever happened. To be given a stillness, he could stand inside and never again be asked to reach into the dark and fail. That is the man who stood at the left pillar of Ambergate. That is why he knew the wrong sound 3 seconds early, and why the word Ironmarsh went into him like a blade, and why, when Rourke Doyle unhooked 6 feet of hardened steel and swung it at his head, Imrise Calder did not flinch and did not fall and did not, above all, harm the man swinging it. Because 11 years before, on a bridge of chain in a flood, he had held Rourke Doyle's brother by the wrist and lost him, and there was not a force on earth that could have made him break another Doyle now. "Come back with me to the arch." The old man's words, "You're the quiet chain, you're Calder's boy," hung over the cobbles, and I watched them do to Rourke Doyle what the Swung chain had failed to do to Calder. They broke him. Not his body. His body was already down on one knee, held. They broke the thing inside him that had ridden all the way up the river road that morning looking for something to hit. "No," Doyle said. He was staring up at Calder's face, and his own had gone the color of ash under the road dust. "No, you're a king's man, you're one of theirs. You stand at their gate in their coat. You don't get to be, you can't be him. He was ours. He was Ironmarsh. He was," his voice failed. "He tried for Callum," everyone said. "He tried for Callum, and the river took them both, and the champion lived and my brother didn't, and I've hated," he stopped. The chain wound about his arm rose and fell with his breathing. "I've hated the champion who lived for 11 years, he said very low, "because it was easier than hating the river. And I've hated the king's city that let the forges die, and the two of them got tangled up in me until I couldn't tell one from the other. And this morning I put on the leather, and I came up here to." He looked at the chain on his own arm as if seeing it for the first time. "God help me. I came up here to swing my brother's kind of death at the man who tried to save him." "Callum's chain," Calder said quietly. Doyle went still. "That's Callum's toe chain," Calder said. "It was not a question. I know the links. Your father drew that gauge at the Tower Forge. There's a twist in the weld every 9th link, his signature. No other smith in Ironmarsh laid a weld like it. I have thought about your father's welds for 11 years. He looked down at the steel wound around Doyle's forearm, and for the first time his composure thinned, and I saw the boy from the Tower Forge look out through the King's Guard's eyes. "You brought your brother's chain up the river to kill me with, and I caught it with the lock I couldn't hold him with. There's a cruelty in the world's arrangements, Rourke, that I have never once been able to forgive. But it is not your cruelty, and it was never mine." I do not think Doyle could have spoken then, if the king himself had commanded it. He knelt on the cobbles with his brother's chain about his arm, and his dead brother's name in the air, and 11 years of misplaced hatred coming apart in him all at once. And he did the thing that no one who had watched him ride up mean and loud that morning would have believed. He bent his head down over his trapped arm, and his shoulders shook, and this enormous bull of a man wept in the dust of the King's Road, while the guard he had tried to kill knelt slowly down in front of him, and with great care unwound the chain from his arm, link by link, and freed him, and did not let go of his hand when it was free. "I'll tell you all of it," Calder said, low only for Doyle. "Every true thing about that night, as I promised, and I've told no one, not in 11 years. I'll tell you where he was and what he said and how he never once let go of the boy behind him, your Callum. He passed a child up the chain before he'd take the grip himself. Did you know that?" "No, no one knew that. I never told it. He saved the last one out before me, your brother did, and if there's an honor roll for that night his name should be at the head of it and not mine." His voice was rough now, all the stone gone out of it. "I'll tell you all of it. But not here and not now, because there is a lady coming down that road who I am sworn to keep, and I have to stand up now, Rourke, and be the king's man again for a little while. Do you understand me? For a little while more I have to be the coat. And Rourke Doyle, I will remember this as long as I remember anything." Rourke Doyle nodded and gripped the guard's hand hard once and said thickly, "I be the coat. I'll not move." And he did not. It was into this, a weeping man kneeling free beside his brother's unwound chain, an old rider leaning on his stick with tears bright on his face, 10 leaderless riders standing bareheaded now, some of them having taken their helmets off without knowing why, and a boy of 19 with his arms still half spread in front of a barrier of families no longer in any danger at all. It was into this that Princess Adela came. She had not waited in the car. I would learn that this was very like her, and that her security detail had long since given up trying to make her behave otherwise. When the escort halted and the outriders reported the arch blocked and a disturbance at the gate, Princess Adela had simply opened her own door and walked, past the protests of her people, Down the last stretch of the river road toward Ambergate, a tall woman in a traveling coat the color of slate, unhurried, taking in the whole strange tableau with steady dark eyes before a single word was spoken. Her guards came fast behind her, and mine, Sergeant Hale and the reserve section, came running up the road at last from where they had been posted below, too late for any of it, as the men who come running always are. I snapped to attention so hard I nearly put my own spine out. Calder rose from beside Doyle and came to attention too, and I saw him do it, saw him gather the coat back around himself, the stillness dropping over the grief like a visor coming down. Princess Adela stopped a few feet away and looked at the two of us, and then at Doyle kneeling, and then at the chain on the cobbles, and then, longest, at Imrais Calder. "Guardsmen," she said, "I am told a man swung a weapon at this gate. I am told there was a chain." Her eyes went over Calder, over me, over the untouched families, over the weeping giant on his knees. "And yet I see no one hurt. Not the crowd, not my guards, not—" She looked at Doyle, the man who swung it. "Will someone explain to me how a chain was swung at the King's Guard on the King's Road, and no one bled?" There was a silence. Sergeant Hale, arriving red-faced, opened his mouth to give the official version, which he did not have, having seen none of it. The old rider drew breath to pour out the whole marvel. Doyle lifted his ruined face as if to take the blame onto himself and be done. But it was I who spoke. I do not know to this day where the nerve came from. I was 19 and had never addressed anything grander than a sergeant. But I had been given one job that morning and had done it, and having done a hard thing I found I could do another, and I heard my own voice come out of me steady and clear across the arch. "Your Highness, the chain was swung." Guardsman Calder stepped inside it and took it out of the air with his hand and bound it round the man's own arm, and set him down without a mark, and has been kneeling in the road these 5 minutes telling him a thing about his dead brother that no one else in the world could tell him. That is how it was swung, and no one bled, Your Highness, because the man it was swung at was the one man alive who would rather have taken the blow than strike back. Princess Adela looked at me for what felt like a year. Then she looked at Calder. "Is the boy exaggerating, guardsman?" she asked. "Yes, Your Highness," Calder said. "He leaves out that it was foolish of me to break my stance, and that a wiser guard would have stood the king's ground and let the marshals take the man, and that I have doubtless earned a reprimand for stepping off my post." A pause. "He is not exaggerating about the rest. And Princess Adela, I have served the house for many years since, and I have never seen it done better." Princess Adela let a small silence hold, and then she said, "I will decide what a wiser guard would have done and whether there is a reprimand to earn, not the marshals and not you." She turned to Doyle. "Stand up," she said, not unkindly. "I dislike speaking to the top of a man's head." Doyle got to his feet. It took him a moment. The fight and the grief had emptied him, and he came up slowly and stood before the princess with his big hands hanging open at his sides, no chain in them now, and I watched him brace for whatever the crown did to men who swung steel at its guards. Prison, at the least. He was ready for it. In a way, I think he had wanted it, a punishment being at least a shape, at least an end to 11 years of shapelessness. "You are from Ironmarsh," Princess Adela said. It was not a guess. She had been listening from the moment she stepped out of the car to more than any of us had realized. "You rode up here this morning to shut my road and make me look at you. Guardsman Calder as good as said it, and you have not denied it. So I am looking at you." She held his eyes, and she did not blink first, and neither did he, and something passed between the tall woman in slate and the broken giant that I did not have the years to name but have thought about ever since. "Now tell me why. Not the chain. The chain I understand. Grief makes fools of stronger men than you. Tell me the thing under the chain. Tell me what a pen in my brother's city did to Ironmarsh." And Rurk Doyle told her. He told her badly, in broken pieces. A man unused to being asked and less used to being heard, but he told her. He told her about the forges gone cold. 300 years of chainsmithing snuffed out in a season when the naval contracts moved to a cheaper yard across the water, and no one in the city thought to ask what 400 families at the far end of a river were to do when the only trade their grandfathers had left them was ended by a signature. He told her about the wharves standing empty and the young men leaving and the old men sitting at cold anvils, about a town that had made the chain that held the king's own fleet for 3 centuries and could not now get a letter answered from the ministry that had unmade it. He told her about the winter and the ones who did not get through it. He did not, I noticed, tell her about his brother. That grief he had given already to the only man who could hold it, and he kept it now. Princess Adela listened to all of it without once interrupting, which is a rarer and greater thing in the powerful than any act of arms. And when he had run down into silence, she was quiet a while, and then she said, "I did not know Ironmarsh had made the fleet chain. I am ashamed to say I did not know Ironmarsh had made anything. That is precisely the ignorance you rode up here to break, and you have broken it, though you chose a poor hammer for the job." She glanced at the tow chain on the cobbles. "Here is what will happen. You will answer to the law for the weapon and the danger to that crowd, because a princess who winks at a chain swung near children is no use to anyone, and I will not insult you by pretending otherwise. But you will answer to it in the light of everything I have seen and heard at this gate, which is a great deal, and I will see to it myself that the light is not lost between here and the courtroom." She let that settle. "And Ironmarsh will have its hearing, not a letter from a ministry. A hearing in the city, with the river families in the room and a member of my own house in the chair, and I will sit in that chair, and the men who moved the naval contracts will explain to me, and to you, what is to be done for a town they emptied. That I promise you on the king's road before these witnesses. It is not your brother back. Nothing is your brother back. It is the looking at that you came for. You shall have it, and it shall have consequences. Now give me your word you will make no more trouble at this gate and go with the sergeant quietly and let this boy," she nodded at me, "stand down before he faints in his fine coat." Doyle gave his word. He gave it in a whisper, and then he did a thing that undid the last of the morning's menace. He turned to Imrais Calder and he put out his big scarred hand, and Calder took it, and Doyle said, "You'll come. You said you'd tell me all of it, about Callum. You'll come." "I'll come," Calder said, "on my next leave. I'll come down to Ironmarsh, and I'll stand where the Tower Forge was, and I'll tell you every word. You have my hand on it." They led Doyle away then, and the leaderless riders with him. Not roughly, Sergeant Hale had the sense, for once, to read the arch he had arrived too late to shape. And the crowd began, in the loose, bewildered way of crowds, to understand that the danger was gone and the marvel over, and to gather up their fallen flags. The princess's escort reformed. The long black car came down through the arch at last, 4 hours of ceremony compressed into 4 late minutes, and Ambergate did the one thing it was there to do. It stood, honey-colored and old, over the meeting of the machines and the crown, exactly as tradition said it should, only with more truth in the picture that day than tradition had ever intended. But there is a coda to the day at the arch, and then a longer coda to the whole of it, and I owe you both, because a story that stops at the rescue leaves out the part that actually changed everything, which is not the second the chain was caught, whatever the singers made of it later, but everything the caught chain set moving afterward. Princess Adela did not simply drive on. Before she re-entered her car, she turned back to where Calder and I stood, returned to our posts at the 2 pillars, stiff as we were meant to be, and she came and stood in front of Imrais Calder and looked up into his still face for a long moment. "The quiet chain," she said softly so that only the 3 of us heard it. "My grandfather saw you fight, you know, at the Ironmarsh Fair when he was young and you were younger. He spoke of it to the end of his life, a boy who won 100 bouts and never marked a man. He said it was the finest self-command he ever witnessed in any arena, and that the realm would be safe if its soldiers had 1/10 of it." She tilted her head. "He wondered, my grandfather, what had become of you." "You simply vanished," he said. I shall be able to tell the family what became of you. You became the coat, a very small smile. And when the coat was tested with a live chain in front of 100 frightened people in the house itself, you won 101st bout and never marked your man. I think my grandfather would say the record stands. She stepped back. Thank you, Guardsman Calder, for making my mourning a thing I shall be proud to have been part of, rather than one I should have to explain. And Emrise Calder, who had not been able to speak of the flood for 11 years, said only, Your Highness, and it was enough, and she went to her car, and the day at the arch was done. But not the story. Never think the day is the story. The day is only where the story is lit. Word of what had happened at Ambergate reached the palace before Calder and I had finished our watch, because 100 people with 100 devices had stood at that barrier. And though not one of them had understood what they were seeing while it happened, a chain swung, a guard somehow still standing, a giant weeping in the road. Between them they had it all from a dozen angles. And by evening the whole realm had watched a king's guard step into a swung chain and take it out of the air with his bare hand and set a man down in the dust without a mark on him. They watched it over and over. They slowed it down. They argued about whether it was real. And the old ones, the river people scattered up and down the coast, the ones who had grown up at the Iron Marsh Fair, they knew what they were watching from the first frame, and they wept, and they told everyone who would listen. That's the running lock, that's the quiet chain. We thought he was dead these 11 years. He was standing at a gate the whole time. 3 days later, Calder was summoned to the palace. He asked, in the way of a man who has learned to expect the worst of summons, whether it was for the reprimand he had spoken of to the princess, the leaving of his post, the breaking of the ceremonial stance. I went with him as far as the guardroom, for I had been named a witness and my own small account was wanted, and I sat outside a tall door while, on the other side of it, King Alaric received Emrise Calder. I did not hear most of it. I heard the ending, because at the ending the king raised his voice, not in anger, but in the way a man raises his voice when he wants it to carry, when he means what he says to be heard beyond the room and remembered. I am told, the king said, that you expect a reprimand for leaving your post. I have thought about that. A guard's post is the thing he is set to protect. You believe you left yours. I say you did not move an inch from it. There were families 20 feet from a swung chain, and your post that morning was not a painted line on the cobbles under an old arch. Your post was those people's lives, and you did not leave it, you filled it, more completely than any man at that gate in 100 years. There will be no reprimand. A pause and then lower, but I heard it. There is instead a question, and I will only ask it once. The wardens want you back. My sister wants you for her own household detail. She has not stopped speaking of the arch. The instructors at the barracks would give a year's pay to have the quiet chain teach young fools like the one who sat outside my door this morning how a man ends a fight without breaking his own honor or his opponent's arm. Any of these is yours for a word. You need never stand a cold gate at dawn again. So I ask you, Guardsman Calder, what do you want? And I heard Emrise Calder answer, and I have carried the answer with me through every posting of my own life since. Your Majesty, he said, for 11 years I have wanted only one thing, which was to be somewhere nothing happened, so that I would never again be asked to reach into the dark for a man and come back with an empty hand. That is why I asked for a quiet gate. I thought I was asking for peace. I was asking to hide. A silence. The chain found me anyway. It came all the way up the river to find me, in the hand of the brother of the man I lost, and it made me reach into the dark one more time, and this time the lock held. I do not think I am done being asked to reach. I do not think any of us are ever done. But I have learned this week that I would rather stand a cold gate where I might be needed than a warm room where I am only admired. So if it is truly mine to choose, let me keep my post. Let me keep Ambergate. And when the boy is ready, I knew, sitting outside the door, that he meant me, and my face went hot. Let me teach him what my father taught me, on our off hours, in the yard with a padded chain, so that the running lock does not die with me. "That is what I want, your majesty, to stand my gate and to pass the thing along." There was a long quiet from the other side of the door. Then King Alaric said, gruffly, "You are a stubborn man, and I find I trust you the more for it. Keep your gate. And Calder, you will teach the boy, and any other you judge worthy, and you will do it under the king's warrant, so that 100 years from now there is still one hand in this realm that can take a chain out of the air and hurt no one with it. That is my command, and it is the easiest one I have given all year." That is how it was decided, in a room I sat outside of, that Imrais Calder would stay a king's guard at the old river gate, and that I would become, in the off hours, in the empty yard behind the gatehouse, with a 4-foot practice chain padded at the tip, the first student in 11 years of the quiet chain. I want to tell you the rest quickly, because the rest is mostly good, and good news does not need many words. The hearing came. Princess Adela kept her word to the letter, as I would learn she always did. The river families were brought to the city, and put in a room with the men who had moved the naval contracts, and the princess sat in the chair, and made those men account for Ironmarsh to its own people's faces. I am told it was a hard day for a number of comfortable gentlemen. Out of it came a thing that letters had never produced in 3 years. A commission to see whether the old yards might forge again, not fleet chain, for the world had moved on from that, but the great heavy cable and anchor work that the new deep harbors needed, and that no cheaper yard across the water could make to the old Ironmarsh standard. It was not the whole town restored. Nothing restores a whole town. But forges were lit again on the river the next spring, and young men came back to some of them, and the twist in the 9th link weld that Doyle's father had drawn was taught again to hands that had nearly lost it. Princess Adela went down to see the first new anchor chain drawn, and stood in the sparks in her slate coat, and I am told she was smiling. As for Rourke Doyle, he answered to the law as the princess had promised he would, and as he had wanted to. But the law that answered him had on its bench the full account of what had happened at the arch, the grief under the chain, the truth about the flood, the fact that the man he had struck at had spoken for him rather than against him. Calder testified. He stood up in the court in his red coat, and told them the whole of it, the forges and the flood and the brother and the 11 years, and he asked the court to weigh a broken man's grief against a chain that had, in the end, marked no one. Doyle did not walk free. You do not swing steel near a crowd and walk free, and he would not have respected a court that let him, but he was dealt with as a grieving man and not as a monster, and the sentence was one a man could come back from, and he served it, and he came back from it. He runs a forge now. His father's rebuilt on the river at Ironmarsh, drawing anchor chain for the deep harbors. And once a year, on the day of the remembrance ride, a big gray-shot man on a well-kept machine rides up the river road at the tail of the sanctioned column, and he stops at the old honey-colored arch, and he does not swing anything at anyone. He gets off his machine, and he walks up to the left pillar, and he clasps the hand of the guard who stands there, and the two of them stand a moment in the shade with their heads bowed, and then Rourke Doyle rides on up to the Capitol Green, and lays a wreath at the memorial for a young man named Callum who passed a child up a chain before he would take the grip himself. I know because I have watched them do it every year. I still stand the Ambergate detail. I stand the right pillar now, where Calder stood, because Calder, but I am getting ahead of the one last thing I have to tell you, and it is the thing this whole account has been walking toward, so let me slow down and set it right. For 7 years after the morning of the chain, Imrais Calder and I stood the Ambergate detail together, and in the off hours in the walled yard behind the gatehouse where the old toll keepers had once kept their horses, he taught me the running chain. He was a hard teacher and a patient one, which are not opposites, whatever people think. We began with a plain 4-foot length, padded and wrapped, and for the first 3 months he would not let me swing it at all. He made me learn the arc first, where the steel is fast and where it is slow, the terrible outside and the harmless inside, the exact pocket near the hand where a swung chain forgets its own speed. "You cannot trap what you fear," he told me over and over in the yard in the gray mornings. "And you cannot help but fear it until you understand it. So understand it. The chain is not your enemy. The chain is only obeying the rules it was made to obey. Learn the rules better than it does, and it will lie down in your hand like a tired dog." It took me 2 years before I could roll a running lock clean out of a live swing, and when at last I did it, took the padded chain out of the air and folded it back on my own turning hand without a mark, Emrise Calder, who did not smile easily, smiled and said, "There. Now the record is safe. Now it does not die with me." I did not understand then how much he had meant by that. He grew old at the gate. That is a strange thing to watch happen to a man you first met as a wall of red discipline. To see the wall soften year by year into an old soldier with a bad shoulder that ached before rain, the shoulder the river had wrenched from its socket 11 years before I ever met him. He never spoke of the flood to me directly, not once in 7 years, though I knew all of it by then from the old writer and from Doyle. But I noticed that after the morning of the chain something in him had unclenched. He stood the gate as straight as ever, but he was not hiding behind it anymore. He would nod to the bargemen now. He learned the names of the families who came often to photograph the arch. On the day of the remembrance ride he wept openly, every year, when the one-armed woman and the ancient rider in the blanket came up under the arch, and he did not care who saw. A man who has stopped hiding is a lighter man to stand beside. And then in the 8th spring, Rourke Doyle came up the river road not on the day of the ride, but on an ordinary gray Tuesday, and he did not come to swing anything or to clasp a hand at the pillar. He came with an offer. The reborn forges at Ironmarsh had need of a master to teach the young smiths not only the drawing of the chain, but the old art that went with it. The chain dance, the bouts, the running lock, the whole beautiful, useless, glorious tradition that had nearly died in the cold years, and that the town, coming back to life, wanted back. "It's yours if you want it," Doyle said to Calder, standing awkward and enormous in the shade of the arch, turning his cap in his big scarred hands. "The town wants the quiet chain to come home and teach its boys. My own lads among them." He looked at his boots. "I know you asked the king to let you keep your gate, I know it, but the gate's not home, Emrise. Ironmarsh is home, and there's a forge with your father's name still cut in the lintel stone, waiting." Calder was quiet a long while. Then he looked at me. I was at the right pillar, pretending very hard not to be listening, and he said, "The gate is in good hands, better than mine. The boy stands it as well as any man I ever saw, and he can teach the next one the lock as well as I taught him." He turned back to Doyle. Rourke, I'll come home. It's time. A man ought to end where he began if he's lucky enough to be let. And that gray Tuesday, that is what was decided." He took his leave of Ambergate a month later, on a bright morning very like the one this whole account began with. There was no ceremony. He would not have one. He simply stood his last watch at the left pillar, and at the end of it he unpinned from inside his tunic a thing I had never known he carried, a single link of old chain, one heavy hand-drawn link with a twist in the weld, worn smooth as a river stone from 11 years, no, from 19 years of being held. Callum Doyle's chain. He had kept one link of it all that time, since the court gave the rest back to Rourke. He pressed it into my glove and closed my fingers over it. "When you teach the next one," he said, "and there will be a next one and one after that, when you teach him the lock, you show him this and you tell him whose it was. Tell him a man passed a child up a chain before he'd save himself. Tell him that is what the lock is for, not to win, to hold. We are not in the business of winning. You and I, we stand a gate and we hold. Do you understand me now at last?" "I understand you now," I said, and I did. He walked down the river road in the ordinary clothes of an ordinary man, an old soldier with a bad shoulder going home, and he did not look back, and I stood my post and let him go, because that was my post, to stand and to hold, and to let the ones I loved walk on down the road toward whatever peace was waiting for them. That was many years ago. Emrise Calder taught the young smiths of Ironmarsh the running chain for the rest of his days, and died in his own bed above his father's forge with the river he had made his peace with running below the window, an old and honored and finally unburdened man. Rourke Doyle's own son took the champion's belt at the reborn Iron Marsh Fair, and never marked a man in the bouts, and when they asked him where he had learned such control, he said his master had learned it from a king's guard who once caught his father's chain out of the air and refused to be his enemy. And the running lock did not die. It lives in the yard behind the gatehouse still, and it lives on the river, because one man was too disciplined to strike back and too honest to keep hiding. I am an old guard now myself. My shoulder aches before the rain. There is a boy at the right pillar these days who is 19 and white as his gloves, and last week, in the walled yard behind Ambergate, I put a padded 4-foot chain into his hands for the first time and would not let him swing it, and told him he must learn the arc before the lock, because you cannot trap what you fear. He looked at me the way I once looked at Calder, as though I were a wall, a statue, a thing made of nothing. He does not know yet what a still man can hold inside him. He will learn. And when he can roll a clean running lock at last, in a year, in 2, I will take out of my tunic a single heavy link of old chain worn smooth as a river stone, and I will press it into his glove, and I will close his fingers over it, and I will tell him whose it was, and what it is for. To hold, not to win, to stand a gate and to hold. That is the whole of it. A biker swung a heavy chain at the Royal Guard on a bright morning at an old river arch, and in the next second everything changed, not because a chain was caught, though it was, and cleanly, but because a man who had spent 11 years hiding from the dark reached into it one more time and came back at last, with a hand that was not empty. Everything after that, the town rekindled, the brother's honor restored, the grief laid down, the running lock passed hand to hand down the years so that it will outlive us all. Everything after that came out of that one still second at the gate. That is what the singers never quite get right. The second the chain was caught was not the change. It was only the spark. The change was everything the spark set alight, and it is burning yet, in a walled yard behind an old arch on the river road, where an old guard is teaching a frightened boy that the hardest and highest thing a strong man can do is to hold a terrible power in his hand, and choose and go on choosing, to hurt no one with it. I keep the gate I hold, and that is enough.